Now, the next question is, how can we do that same thing that we did in our command line when we said find and we managed to grab hold of all of our documents inside our items collection? How can we do that inside our app.js so that we can actually send it over to our list.ejs to render in our to-do list? This is what the mongoose find method looks like. We specify the model name, and then we specify some conditions, and then we get a callback which includes an error and the results from the find if there were any. And then we can use the results document inside that callback. So as a challenge, I want you to be able to log all of the items inside our items collection, but do that from our app.js. Pause the video and try to complete the challenge. All right, so we're going to try and find them, and then we're going to send them over to our list.ejs. So I'm going to call that mongoose method right here inside my root route. I'm going to tap into the model, which represents our collection of items, and then I'm going to use that find method I spoke about earlier on. Now, in this case, the conditions for our find is actually pretty much just find all. So it's just going to be an empty set of curly braces. This will find us everything that's inside our items collection. And then once we found those items, then we can trigger the callback, which has an error and found items, or anything you wish to call it, really. But this is going to contain the things that we found inside the items collection. Now that we've got that, we can log our found items. And now I can get this method to trigger if I just go and access my homepage or my root route. Let's save our app.js. Let's go back into our terminal, and I'm going to hit Control-C to end my process, and now I'm going to start it off with NodeMon. This way it will run our app every single time I make some changes in our app.js. Now our Node server is up and running, and if we go over to our localhost 3000 and hit refresh, so while we're able to log all of our items by using that find function that Mongoose gave us over here, our website is kind of broken because it doesn't know what this thing items is that we're trying to pass over to our list.ejs. And that's because items no longer exist, right? Items referred to our items array, which we deleted, and instead we want to pass over the found items instead. So let's go ahead and move our res.render into this callback here. And instead of logging the found items, I'm going to pass over the found items to our list.ejs instead. So now if we hit save, NodeMon should update our server. And if we go ahead and refresh our website, then you can see we no longer have any bugs. But we still have some problems though. And the first problem is that our items are being rendered in their entirety, like the entire document is being put into each one of our list items here. What we want is just the part that comes in the name field, right? Not the whole ID and version and all of the rest of it. So that's problem number one. Now, problem number two is that every single time that we rerun our app.js with NodeMon, we insert more items into our database because it's rerunning this item.insert_many line of code. That means if I go over here and I just hit RS to restart my server, now if I refresh my localhost 3000, I have even more items, which is not what we want at all. We only want it to have 3. So let's see how we can address these two problems. Now, the first one is slightly easier to address. If we head over to our views and go over to our list.ejs, then you can see that here we're rendering each of the list items just by carrying out a simple for loop. This is the traditional for loop, right? And we're tapping into this thing called new list items at the index I. And each of these items happens to be a document inside our items collection. Instead of adding the entirety of the documents collection, we can simply tap into its name field. So now when I head back to my to-do list and I refresh, we're only putting in the name field of each of the items instead. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to give you a challenge. Because currently we're using this traditional for loop and it's making it a little bit cluttered and it's a little bit hard to see what's actually going on. As a challenge, I want you to implement the for each method that we get access to in JavaScript ES6 or newer versions. Just as a reminder, the for each syntax looks something like this. We tap into a method on an array. Every array in the newer versions of JavaScript has access to this thing called for each. And inside the for each method, we get to have a callback function, and we get to tap into every single one of the items inside the array. And then we get to use it inside the callback. Now, as a challenge, I want you to pause the video and rewrite our simple for loop into a for each loop and still make it work when we reload our to-do list website. All right, so first things first, I'm going to leave our for loop aside and I'm going to rewrite it from scratch. The thing that we have access to over here is something called new list items, and that corresponds to all of the found items that we passed over inside our root route. That means we can tap into this thing called new list items, and we know it's an array of item documents. So therefore, we can call the for each loop on it. And inside the parentheses, we pass in a callback function, which allows us to tap into each item inside that array. And now we open up our callback, and inside these curly braces, we can use each of those item documents. Inside here, I'm going to copy and paste my div. And instead of using the new list items at indexi.name inside my paragraph, I'm just going to tap into that item object that I get access to now and type .name to access the name property. And now all I have to do, because this is EJS, I'm going to include those little angle brackets and percentage signs around every single line where I have some code. So it's the first and the last line, basically. So now I can go ahead and delete what remains of my traditional for loop. And if I hit save and refresh, we still get exactly the same appearances of our to-do list and nothing has broken, even though we've refactored our for loop to turn it into a for each loop. Now, the next problem we're going to tackle is all of these repeated inserts. The simplest solution, which we did previously, is we simply commented out this insert many method after the first time it's run. But if you imagine that if our server is hosted somewhere like Heroku or somewhere else, we can't actually go in there after the first time it's run and then sort of comment out a function, right? It doesn't really work. So how can we do this in a little bit of a better way? Well, we kind of only want our default items to be inserted if our items collection is actually empty, right? So we have to somehow check when a user accesses the root route whether if the items collection is empty, in which case we're going to add all of our default items, but otherwise we're not going to add another set of default items in there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clear out our database. And we can do that the easiest inside our Mongo shell. So if we go ahead and see which DB we're using, we're currently using the ToDoList DB. If I write db.drop database, parentheses, then I will execute the command to basically delete my database. So now if I write show DBs, you can see the ToDoList DB no longer exists. So we have a blank slate and we're going to recreate it using our app.js. Now, if I comment out this part where we're actually inserting our items into our items collection and I hit save, then when my app runs, you can see I have no items at all. And if I tried to log my found items here, then if I refresh my homepage, tap into the root route, and have a look in my console, then what I get is just an empty array. So an array with no items, right? How can we check for this? How can we check to see if our collection of items is empty or if the array has no items? Well, we can simply use an if statement and check what is the length of this array called found items. Because if it's equal to 0, then that means we have the same condition as we have right now, right? Just an empty array. We didn't find any items inside that collection. Well, in that case, and only in that case, do we actually want to save our default data. So now I'm going to move this insert many into here, and I'm going to uncomment it to insert our default items into our database if there are currently no items in the collection. Else, however, I'm not going to add anything, and I'm just going to render my list.ejs. Currently, I have no items inside my items collection. If I hit save and I go into my browser and I hit refresh, you can see that inside my console, it tells me that I've successfully saved my items to the database. But on the browser, I'm not getting those items show up, right? So how can I get it to do that? Well, if we take a look at the code, when our items collection has no items, then we simply just insert 3 new items in there. But then that's kind of the end, right? We don't render anything. We don't try and render those items that we just added. As a shortcut, what we can do is we can simply call res.redirect, and we redirect back onto the root route. So what this will do is it'll check firstly to see if there are any items in our items collection. And if there are none, then it's going to create 3 items and add it into our items collection. And then finally, it's going to redirect back into this root route. But now, this time, it's not going to fall into the if block. Instead, it's going to go into the else block, because now we actually do have items in our items collection, and we're able to res.render those new items over to our list.ejs. So let's run that again. And now you can see if we refresh our website, we have all of our default items showing up. But no matter how many times I restart my server, I've still only got 3 items and it doesn't start building up.